Well, I would like to introduce Dr. Cobb, and I know that all of you, I bet, on this call know him well, but maybe not. There are many of your students here, Dr. Cobb, but there are some who may not know you. I know Ira Tucker is just getting to know you. And we're very fortunate to celebrate this 50th anniversary of Earth Day with you, John. You are a planetary treasure. And no one in our human family that I know of has worked harder or for as many years with the kind of dedicated service that you have for God's creation. And we give you thanks. Dr. Cobb is an environmentalist, a theologian, a philosopher. He's the world's major interpreter of Alfred North Whitehead, whose ideas challenge what John calls modernity. Ideas that life has no purpose, that we are separate beings floating around in space. John Cobb has not only taught Whitehead process philosophy and theology, he has modeled what it means to live a life of purpose. An intellectual giant like Whitehead, but he is more than that. He is a man of deep feeling with a tender and loving heart. He worked for decades as a professor at Claremont School of Theology, where I went to school. He's become a global leader with moral courage who has said for decades that the emperor has on no clothes and that we are destroying God's creation. His book, Is It Too Late? A Theology of Ecology, was his prophetic call 50 years ago, and he has worked tirelessly in service all of these years, teaching, preaching, writing dozens of books, editing many others, writing hundreds of articles, educating us in order to make the world sustainable and survivable for an ecologic civilization. His Seizing an Alternative International Ecology Conference in 2015 changed my life and was indeed the inspiration for this church, Church for a Common Home. John is the son of missionaries. He was born and grew up in Japan, and he's the best ambassador for not only Christianity, but for religion of anyone I've ever known. His appetite for life and justice is like a contagion. He inspires his students to explore transdisciplinary study of God and the world, including economics, culture, philosophy, theology, the arts, science, psychology, education, and more. I want to thank you personally for affirming my feelings, Dr. Cobb. What a precious gift in a world that too often is numb from having banished or repressed feelings altogether. You're a man of intellectual genius and one of deep feeling. What a rare and unusual combination. I know John as someone who loves to talk. And when we are together, I feel like he is my best girlfriend. One of his many accomplishments has been his support of many of the earliest feminist theology who changed the academy and rewrote theology in a similar way that he has with process theology. Thank you for your support of all of us, women in particular. The conversation often comes back when you're talking to John about education. For John is a gifted teacher, and he's passionate about the need for us to change our educational systems. I myself began to study Rudolf Steiner, intentional community and biodynamic farming at John's invitation and support, and that coupled with the experience of traveling with him in China last year has catapulted me and our small Church for our Common Home into a new grand adventure here that we now, as of today, will call the John Cobb Farm here in Oregon. Today, I invite everyone here to rededicate our lives to feeling deeply for the world and to live as fully and work as hard as Dr. Cobb for almost a century. It was after John retired from a long and esteemed career as a seminary professor that he began his work with ecologic civilization in China. His work there with Dr. Zaha Wang and Dr. Mei Wang is off the charts in inspiration. I experienced firsthand how Dr. Cobb has become like a rock star in China, a country that teaches process philosophy more than any place perhaps on the planet, with 36 process centers at major universities in China. May we all have the imagination and courage to begin such adventures as you have with your adventure in China, Dr. Cobb, at every stage of our life, and particularly in our so-called retirement years. Dr. Cobb is equal parts intellectual genius, Southern gentleman, and holy man. He's one of the most loving and lovable people I have ever known. As we launch an adopted grandchild program to work in the John Cobb farm, may we all make a promise today to follow in your footsteps, John, as we work to create an ecologic civilization, learning and teaching ways of cooperation, giving up our habits of competition, learning to love our enemies, praying for our persecutors, celebrating and sharing our deep feelings of love for one another and all creation as we live lives of meaning like you have. Perhaps most importantly, may we take on, John, your grit, for you have never given up in 50 years. Your work and service and faithfulness is a great inspiration for all of us. We love you and we thank you, Dr. Cobb, for your inspiration, for your life of service to our common home, Mother Earth. And I promise you that I will try to be a loving adopted grandparent to as many young people and to be as much like you have with your students as I possibly can, and to follow in your footsteps as a faithful disciple of Jesus. Thank you, John. I think Kevin is going to read us our scripture.
Okay.
A minute. This is Jesus speaking from the Gospel of Matthew 5, verses 43 to 47. You have heard it said, love your neighbor, but hate your enemy. But I tell you, love your enemies and pray for your persecutors. This will prove that you are children of God. For God makes the sun rise on the bad and the good alike. God's rain falls on the just and the unjust. If you love those who love you, what merit is there in that? Don't tax collectors do as much?
Thank you, Kevin. I think when the scriptures are read that way, people really hear what is being said. And that is very important. Am I being heard?
Yes.
Yes.
We can hear you well, John. Yes.
Okay. I think everyone will gather that I'm not completely comfortable in this modern age. But I find Zoom a wonderful alternative to actually getting together. So I'm not unhappy about it. And of course, Bonnie, I want to thank you for your introduction. It always makes me feel good to hear you talk about me. And it may make me feel a little too good, but other people sometimes help to balance a little bit. In some ways, it helps to balance a lifetime of being not quite accepted as being on the right and sensible path. I'm happy always to be countercultural because I think that the modern culture is destroying the planet, and I don't want to be part of that. But even the alternate culture found it very, very difficult to take the natural world with full seriousness. If one thinks of the succession of great programs, great movements that came, I think we all greatly admire the liberation theology movement in Latin America, but they were not extremely interested in the natural world. That was a marginal matter. And in relation to people who made that their primary preoccupation, they were a little bit, what shall I say, uncomfortable with Whiteheadian thinking. I won't go into all of this, but it is wonderful in my old age to find that lots of people now agree with me that saving the world from self-destruction is #1 priority, which in no way means that we're not interested in justice for all people. And the wonderful liberation movements have all contributed. But if the world doesn't endure, I mean, if humanity doesn't survive, the planet will be here, of course. But if humanity doesn't survive, all of those achievements have a short life, shall we say. So I'm delighted that there's far more interest in Whitehead now than there was even a few years ago. My basic conviction for a long time has been that as long as our thinking is ruled by Descartes and Kant, both of whom are dualists of rather extreme sort, we are not going to act in a way that will allow us to humanity to continue to survive. So I take the philosophy part of this whole matter very, very seriously. And when we, at the beginning of the century, some of us said, this is going to be the Whiteheadian century, we all laughed when we said it because we were so marginal. Whitehead was not taught in universities in this country at all, or in Europe. So how could we really seriously talk about this being the Whiteheadian century? But of course, what we meant was, it's got to be the Whiteheadian century. No, that doesn't have to be Whiteheadian, but it has to overcome the problems that Whitehead overcame, and we don't know who else has done it in an effective way. But I'm deeply encouraged by the fact that lots of people now are recognizing that we really do need to change, really do need to change. It's easy to say it, but most people just don't want that change to really make a huge difference in the way they live. Or they don't want the change to require that they get involved in things that they're not interested in, on and on and on. But I think now more and more people, yes, we really have to change the way we think, and that will change the way we live, and that will change the way society is organized. It will drastically change the way we run our schools. I'll talk about that a little bit later, but the schools have been the citadel of the worst of modernity. And it is painful after having spent one's life in a career to realize how damaging most of what goes on there is to the prospects of a healthy future. Well, so much for that. In spite of my excitement about wonderful changes, and I don't want you to think from the rest of what I say that I don't appreciate it, we have to recognize that thus far, the leadership of the world is nowhere near making those changes. In the 50 years since Earth Day, the human situation on the planet has gotten consistently worse. Looked a little hopeful for a while in the 60s that maybe people would pay attention to the problem, but that faded. And just think of a few things that may have caught your attention in the news last year, though actually the news didn't pay much attention to them. One of them, in the Amazon forest, with the encouragement of the president of Brazil, the fires by which people clear the forest so that they can raise cattle were much more extensive than they had been before. The Amazon forest will not be with us much longer, unless we change very, very deeply. But I think much less were we aware of the fact that one of the great forests of the world was simply totally destroyed intentionally for money, for the purpose of making money with palm plantations. That is on the island of Borneo, which had thousands of species that don't exist anywhere else. The forest was systematically cut down. This at a time when we know that having more trees is what we need, not getting rid of the ones that we have. And we could go on with many other things, but for me, one of the most shocking things is that our governments and the people don't really seem to care whether we have any pollinators or not. For we're wiping out the population of bees. And without that, there'll be many crops that we can no longer produce. Why isn't there real concern about that? But the one problem with the capitalist system or with the corporatist system, we are not obedient to capitalist principles. We just socialize specific ways of helping big corporations. But I would have thought that everybody would be interested in there being some food supply for generations not to come. And that when we see we are killing the bees and other pollinators, that would raise a hue and cry that would stop it. But so far it has not. And last year was one of the worst. And the consequences of these and other ways in which we have continued to ignore the needs of the planet and the needs of the world, the natural surroundings in the world, the consequences have begun to be very present and very immediate and very real, rather than threats in the future. And I'll mention one, the fact that just the whole continent of Australia went up in flames. Really one of the massive forest fires of all time that we know about. And the Great Barrier Reef, which is the largest coral in the world, has died. Not perhaps in every last detail, but it has been dying for a long time, but it went much further in 2019 than it has before. And everyone is very much aware of the virus and its global impact. And I think it's all for me somehow summed up in the fact that the government of Indonesia, which has been in the city of Jakarta with 10 million people, has realized that Jakarta is just slipping into the sea. It will not survive very many years. So what do? They move to Borneo, where they have arranged for huge palm plantations that can probably bring in enough money to keep them comfortable, while the 10 million people of Jakarta look after themselves. So much going on that is so painful to know about, but at the same time, it's not totally without hope. Well, what now are we called to do and to be? I think that's the question that especially sermons need to address. And I'm sure you all understood very clearly what Kevin was saying. Jesus is not simply calling us to love our neighbor as ourselves and to love God. That was standard Jewish teaching. And I'm sure there were other Jews who went beyond it. But the whole focus of Jesus' ministry, what made it different from everybody else, was that we should love our enemies. Now, he was talking very specifically about Rome. Lots of Jews did not like being a part of the Roman Empire. They did not want to have Caesar as their ruler, and they kept rebelling. And Jesus understood that if they kept rebelling, if they hated Rome and expressed their hatred of Rome in this way, it wouldn't do them any good. They would be destroyed. There was, he thought, another way. And he thought that way was love. And to love the Romans wouldn't mean necessarily to cooperate with them. But he gave concrete instances, and his life included concrete instances. And I think he was right. The only hope for Israel at his time was that the Jews treat the Romans with love instead of with anger, resentment, resistance, and fighting. And the Jews could not hear that. I mean, many of them could not hear that. And so they did destroy. Israel disappeared. Jerusalem was gone. He was not wrong in understanding that it was the only way. But it's very, very hard for people to hear that they should love their enemies. It's beyond what nature seems to call for. And that doesn't mean that Christians somehow have been freed from that problem of hearing Jesus. If we had loved Islam when Islam appeared, imagine what a different world we would have had. And Islam would have been willing to be a friendly partner and a cooperator with us. But no, they were the enemy, and we must fight them and try to destroy them. So, and I'm going to speak very briefly about something else. I've only recently learned about this, but it's a very painful realization. In the year 1452, Nicholas V, the Catholic Pope, he reigned from 1447 to 55, issued a papal bull under the title Dum Diversas. It primarily authorized King Alonso V of Portugal to conquer and subjugate Muslims and pagans. Specifically, the Pope granted the Portuguese king permission to invade, search out, capture, vanquish, and subdue all Saracens and pagans whatsoever, and other enemies of Christ wheresoever placed, and to reduce their persons to perpetual slavery. This was the head of the Christian Church of the West. And what it did was not actually to have much effect with respect to the Muslims, but it became the banner under which the Catholic countries justified their treatment of the indigenous people of the New World, to murder them, to slaughter them, and to enslave them was supposed to be good Christian acts in obedience to the church. It would be nice to say, of course, Protestants didn't do anything like that, but sadly, our record with indigenous people in North America and in Africa has been also one of slaughter and enslavement. So Jesus' message that we should love others, not just our friends, but everyone, including those who are different from us and opposed to us, has not been one that Christians have heard gladly. They have been we have been, I shouldn't say they, we have been very, very slow. When we heard the message again in 50 years ago that we should also love nature, well, I think that sounded sort of nice, as long as love is something romantic and sentimental. but that we should really treat nature in terms of the needs of nature, rather than simply as an instrument to meeting our own pleasures and enjoyment, that message could not be heard. But if we ask then today, what is it that we are called to do and to be? It's the same thing again. We're called to love our enemies, our opponents. And I'm afraid that the church as a whole is still not hearing that. It's sad to me that we are so emphatic about being open to all kinds of people. But when we mention our political opponents in the United States, it doesn't sound like we're really eager to have them come worship with us. They would make us very uncomfortable, and we don't want that. And we really don't love them. And so we attack them for being messengers of hate. But we are often messengers of contempt, and contempt is not that much different. So, nevertheless, in spite of the fact that we are not hearing it, there are wonderful exceptions. And I think in the last maybe 2 centuries, certainly in the last century, the number of Christians who have been able to hear the heart of Jesus' message, loving the opponent, has increased. And in the second half of the 20th century, there were some wonderful examples. I only need to mention them. There was Gandhi in India. There was Martin Luther King in the United States. And there were key leaders of the Black South Africans who recognized that their relation to their opponents and oppressors must be one of forgiveness and love. I don't think before, and they all recognized they were getting their message from Jesus, that the connection I'm making there is not in question. And they all had remarkable success. That doesn't mean that things in India have been just wonderful and no more problems after even Gandhi was terribly distressed that his call did not prevent Muslims and Hindus from attacking and fighting each other and separating. That was terrible disappointment to him. And a large percentage of the Black population in the United States is not much better off now than it was before. Before there was an attempt by the law to enforce equality and justice. There's much, much more to be done. But his king nevertheless changed the whole world's understanding of racial differences and how we should relate to them. Amazing accomplishment. So we can say both that we have many examples, many examples of refusing to listen. And their outcome has been terrible. And we have a few examples of listening. And though their outcome is not perfect, it is a great improvement, much, much better. So the evidence is that listening to Jesus is not a foolish thing to do. Nevertheless, the likelihood of getting hundreds of millions of people to listen to Jesus in a heroic way, and the examples I've given were of true heroes, true saints, I think. That likelihood is not great. But I have chosen as the title something that uses words that don't immediately sound quite so extreme, as saying you should love your enemy. but I'm talking about the relationship between individuals and community, or we can say between competition and cooperation. Now, there's no question but that competition is part of human existence. And even if there was a possibility of doing away with it, we would need to think a lot before we did that. There are many fine expressions of competition. Competition can contribute to great gains. It's not an unmitigated evil by any means. But the people who promote competition in modernity often really dismiss cooperation. This has been true in biology, it's been true in economics, it's certainly true in the general metaphysics that underlies all of the disciplines. Cooperation simply is not favored in the metaphysics and in the concrete expressions of that metaphysics, in particular academic disciplines, for example, or sectors of society. That so if one finds that, well, actually, you know, species survive better if they cooperate, that's obviously true, rarely mentioned by evolutionists, but cannot really be questioned. Well, they would point out that cooperation is simply being used as a method of competing better. Well, okay, that can be said. All right. But the same thing is generalized, so that any kind of cooperation in meeting the economic needs of human beings is also viewed as trivial, marginal, unimportant. I think that there is a widespread realization. It hasn't gotten into the academy, I'm afraid, but outside of the academy, that when we face a crisis, as we have been facing with respect to a virus, it brings out a lot of cooperation. There are lots of people in lots of parts of the world who are cooperating. And to just deny that fact and ignore it and dismiss it, that's the modern way, but I have no patience with it. And I hope that we can make people who say that face a few facts. I'm so eager that universities actually become open to reality and allow reality to influence their theory. Of course, I can't ask the universities to listen to Jesus because they've already dismissed his relevance. But I could ask the church. The church could listen. But what I'm asking for is not that cooperation become everything and competition become nothing. But I'm asking that we have competition with the goal of its making the cooperation better, instead of dismissing the cooperation or allowing it only as an instrument of competing better. I want to, in order to make one, I hope, to communicate the distinction of the two, I want to look at sports, because obviously sports can be very competitive. And I'm talking about competitive team sports as my example. First of all, there's competition in order to be chosen to be on the team. And I think that's okay. And then there is competition with one's teammates, because one would like to be recognized one of the top players on the team. But if the competition to be the top player on the team interferes with one working in a teamwork way, cooperatively with the other members, that is not going to get anybody very far. Very soon you will be dismissed from the team because your attitude is not the cooperative attitude, of teamwork. But we can say here, all this teamwork and cooperation is for the sake of defeating other teams. So that once again, it's cooperation in the service of competition. But that's not quite true. And therefore, it is because that's not quite true that sports have played a positive role overall. Of course, everything is ambiguous, but I would say a positive role overall. And when people go to watch the competition of teams, it is very important to them, consciously or unconsciously, that the idea of sportsmanship is being fully followed by all the participants. That means that there are things that that one who is seeking victory of his team will not do to the opponents. One does respect the other team. That is, that there are efforts on the part of those who organize sports to keep a feeling of respect for your opponents, even when you're working very hard to defeat them. And if you succeed in defeating them, you still show respect for them. Now let's just imagine that we said, no, victory is the only thing that counts. Competition is the only thing that's important. So what we want is simply to have the kind of team and have the situation that will cause it to win. Well, then, of course, one of the first things you would do would be to see which of the coaches not coaches, umpires you could bribe. Because umpires make a huge difference. And they have to have also this very strong sense of impartiality in order that the sports works well. But if we say, oh, no, sportsmanship doesn't amount to anything, this concern for something larger, beyond, greater than victory, that's all nonsense. Victory is the only thing that counts. Then people would go to the game and they would know that very likely the bribery that had gone on in advance, or maybe not, maybe worse than bribery, maybe people had even poisoned members of the other team to keep them from playing. All kinds of things would be legitimate. Okay. I don't think that lots of people would care much about going to see the sports teams compete if the game was already rigged in that way. So sportsmanship is the deeper loyalty beyond victory. And sportsmanship is a cooperative arrangement. So I don't think sports are an example where competition is the ultimate. Sports are an example where competition makes the whole sport interesting, intensely alive. It draws out the best in a lot of people, as competition can really draw out the best in people. But it is all for the sake of the game. And the quality of the game and the quality of the relationships among people that maintain loyalty to sportsmanship are extremely important. Wouldn't it be wonderful if politics could be like that? If both sides, they could fight themselves over real issues, okay, really quarrel about them, really argue against each other. But they would both really care primarily for the well-being of the nation. And if the well-being of the nation led to their defeat, they would accept it. Unfortunately, in this, even if it ended up there, we would still be in keen trouble. If the relationships among nations has to be competitive, we're not going to survive. The wonderful thing about our experience when we face an issue that affects us all in many, many different countries is that it brings out a cooperation among people of different nationalities. It's not impossible. The vision of a United Nations was a wonderful vision. Unfortunately, in order to be realistic, they had to give veto power to a few countries. The United Nations have not been allowed, and then of course the US exercises its economic strength to bully a lot of countries into supporting it. I don't mean to get off into that. I just mean I'm not holding up either the League of Nations or the United Nations as successful in becoming a place where nations really cooperate for the sake of something larger. But that idea is not strange. And if we don't adopt it, if we don't find a way to make it happen, if Americans care more about their power over other people than they do about the survival of anybody, at least American leaders, we really don't have a future. Now, I think that it was appalling that in the whole of the Democratic primary, there was almost no discussion of what changes are needed in order for the nation to survive. I'm a great admirer of Bernie Sanders, but he really didn't guide us to that. He was trying to persuade us that we could become more like most of the countries of Europe have been for a long time. And that's considered very radical here, but that's just us. We are a special people, and therefore we make special mistakes. And our mistakes have enormous consequences for the rest of the world. Now, one more thing we need to say, and this makes it all the more difficult. Even if we followed Jesus, and if we understood that the others we were to love were other human beings and that only, we would not survive. We have to go beyond Jesus. The two Francises go beyond Jesus. I don't think it contradicts anything in Jesus. Jesus is very clear that God loves everything and the whole world. But we must take the natural world, make it more central than it is for Jesus. And the two Francises have done that. The Saint Francis and the Pope Francis. It's not impossible. There are many, many others who are doing it. I think it is genuine faithfulness to Jesus to change, to enlarge. His world was Israel and Rome. Our world is humanity and the whole of the natural world. One reason that I am so appreciative of Bonnie Tarwater is that she really, really loves the soil. And if you really, really love the soil, you will really, really resist the destruction of life, which is what the destruction of nature amounts to. And I am deeply grateful to her for giving me this chance to unload on you. I am very frightened about the future. I believe at least that we who claim to be Christians should listen to Jesus. And if we do, it's really amazing how many people who are not Christians are also willing to listen to Jesus. Gandhi was a Hindu, and he was the one who listened best to Jesus soonest. So I would like for us to understand that listening to Jesus on this point and on many others is not to separate Christians from others. I think there are lots of people who will join us in listening to Jesus. May it be so. Amen.